Good evening. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all our participants this evening. Thank you for joining us in the launch of the 2020 State of Conservation Report. I am Coral Burse. I'm the Executive Director for Biodiversity Capabilities at CapeNature. Our purpose and function is to develop and deploy biodiversity capability to support, inform and enable nature conservation and enhance biodiversity resilience in the province in the face of global change. Biodiversity Day 2021 is celebrated on the 22nd of May. It is celebrated annually, and this year the theme is "We're part of the solution, #4Nature." An apt call to action, and we are excited for you to join us in learning more about the special biodiversity in the Western Cape and the role that CapeNature plays, and hope to inspire you to adopt a #4Nature motto. Before I kick off, please note that if you wish to post a comment or a question, post it to the Q&A box. My team and I will try to provide answers during the session. However, if we're not able to respond, we will respond in a follow-up email. You are also welcome to post any additional questions to learning@capenature.co.za. Also, we will be giving away a fantastic prize this evening, a wild card valued at 1,450 Rand, so please stay tuned for the draw at the end. I'm going to provide you with a snapshot overview of the Western Cape State of Conservation Report, which can be downloaded from the CapeNature website. In the About Us section, I will introduce you to my team and facilitate a Q&A session on the content of the report. I'm just going to share my screen now. So we are excited to showcase the annual State of Conservation Report, which is intended to provide a snapshot of the state of conservation in the Western Cape and to inform the 5-yearly State of Biodiversity report that we also produce. This report constitutes 24 content pages, which has been primarily published for the electronic media, and in being brief and informative, it contains hyperlinks to an array of other information, sources and material for those who are interested in knowing what lies beyond our presented results. I'd also like to acknowledge that this report represents a multitude of contributions from CapeNature's biodiversity and conservation staff, including field rangers, nature conservators, ecologists, technicians, coordinators, conservation managers, and specialists. CapeNature is the executive arm of the Western Cape Nature Conservation Board, which is the provincial authority responsible for nature conservation in the Western Cape. The entity also manages several protected areas, including World Heritage Sites, provincial nature reserves, and marine protected areas, which supply ecosystem services to citizens, provide climate change resilience and access for ecotourism, research, and environmental education. CapeNature thus implements biodiversity and certain environmental management legislations, policies, procedures, and guidelines in the Western Cape. We contribute to the development of biodiversity legislation and policies provincially and nationally, and we monitor and report on the state of biodiversity in the Western Cape through an annual State of Conservation report. This report updates the IUCN Red List regional global status of species indigenous to the Western Cape. It integrates recommendations from the National Biodiversity Assessment in 2018. It reviews progress against recommendations from the State of Biodiversity report that was published in 2017. It reviews conservation actions, tools, and initiatives. It demonstrates implications of identified threats to biodiversity, and it reflects the latest innovation, research, surveillance, and monitoring results.
Coral, you're sharing the notes. Can you just share the presentation mode?
Sorry, I've been seeing that popping up. comments. I don't know why it was sharing that one. Is it sharing the right one?
That's perfect, Coral. That's perfect.
I apologize. It was right. Okay, I will continue to the next one. So the State of Conservation Report succinctly provides an overview of biodiversity in the province as it relates to species, their abundance, distribution, and their current threat status, to ensure that we can track any changes in these over time and relate these to our strategies and actions. It also provides an update on the threat status of ecosystems in the Western Cape, as these are important informants for land use planning, but mostly as indicators for the provision of ecosystem services, including resilience against droughts, floods, and other natural disasters. The report also provides an update on the status and extent of the conservation and protected areas estate in the province, as well as an indication of how well these are managed. It is also important for tracking our progress towards achieving international goals for the expansion of the protected areas estate, which is demonstrated in the report. The report provides an update on the status and extent of the conservation and protected areas threats as identified in the 2018 National Biodiversity Assessment and the 2017 State of Biodiversity Report. Some threats are direct, while others may be compounding or indirect. However, the matrix facilitates the development of integrated strategies to mitigate the threats. The report also then illustrates our responses to some of the provincial level threats, for example, habitat loss, climate change, biodiversity crime, and pollution. And then at a protected area scale, focuses on the threats which impact on protected areas specifically, for example, fires, which may be too frequent or too large in extent, which are then informed by site-specific assessment of fire frequency through the monitoring of protea recruitment. We highlight the extent of invasive species and biological invasions on protected area, and will be able to demonstrate any significant gains or losses over time. We've developed a number of strategies and tools to assist in the fulfillment of our mandate. We provide a snapshot of what these are with hyperlinks to source documents for further reading. The State of Conservation Report acknowledges numerous conservation partners without which CapeNature would not be able to achieve its successes, and also provides hyperlinks to all of these. I'd now like to introduce you to my team, the panel, who will provide more in-depth content on the State of Conservation Report through a partially prepared question and answer session to which you are invited to participate. Remember to post your questions and comments. So the panel consists of Dr. Andrew Turner. Andrew's work as a restoration ecologist focuses primarily on alien invasive species and fire regimes. Andrew is an excellent all-round ecologist with a broad knowledge base and phenomenal technical skills. He's most passionate about frogs and snakes, and unlike most, the mere glimpse of a snake will make his day. Ms. Jean Gous, her work is primarily focused on ecological health of wetlands and rivers in the province, which is augmented by a keen interest in invertebrates which live in these aquatic habitats. Jean loves the outdoors, is an avid climber, hiker, and runner, just to get to those awesome panoramic views of the spectacular province. Ms. Chanel Rumpetub leads up conservation innovation and keeps us at the forefront of technological applications, processes, and modern conservation practices to improve our capability to keep ecosystems connected and intact to function at their best. Chanel, originally from KZN and accustomed to the warm water ocean, cannot resist taking a dip in any water body, whether it be a river, dam, sea, or large puddle, despite hating cold water. Dr. Martine Jordan generally provides specialist knowledge on all animal species related to their conservation, focusing on priority species. Martine has a background in environmental toxicology and conservation science and is most knowledgeable on indigenous fish and aquatic ecosystem function. Martine is extremely passionate about the redfin minnows, an indigenous freshwater fish species, and loves to ride a horse when not gardening. Mrs. Lucille Ross. Lucille works primarily in compliance and enforcement related to the trade in wildlife and using her expert knowledge of the Western Cape Nature Conservation Ordinance. She strives to empower communities to ensure the protection of biodiversity, whilst being a mother and a wife who loves road running. Lucille is very capable of hiding her fun-loving side and her sense of humor, especially when conducting compliance inspection. And last but not least, is Philippa Huntley. Philippa is primarily responsible for making conservation relevant. She does this by facilitating the update of biodiversity considerations into landscape planning and management through engaging provincial and local government as well as private conservation partners. She's a proponent of living landscapes and the interconnectedness and the commonness amongst all living things. She probably likes to watch birds. So that is my panel, and I'm going to start off with a question to Martine. Good evening, Martine.
Evening.
Martine, could you please explain to us what is the red list status that we refer to and why does it matter?
Well, red list status is really, really important, as the IUCN red list gives an indication of the health of the world's biodiversity. Red list status, it's also commonly referred to as conservation status, is an indication of future extinction risk of a species. So red list status of a species can range from extinct, which is pretty bad because it means the species is gone, it's lost to mankind, through all the other categories right down to least concern, which generally includes widespread, relatively common species that are unlikely to be at risk of extinction in the near future. Red list status is based on standardized criteria from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, also commonly referred to as the IUCN. And the factors affecting the conservation status of a species, amongst others, include population size, the rate of population reduction, reproductive success, extent of occurrence, and also the nature and the magnitude of the threats to the species. Very importantly, the red list assessment also provides information about conservation actions that will help inform the necessary conservation decisions for a species. And as generally, the resources for conservation interventions are generally more sparse compared to the amount of species that are in trouble, the red list status is a really good decision support tool for sort of, getting the most bang for your buck in terms of which species needs interventions.
Thank you very much, Martine. Why are invertebrates important and why are only certain groups, for example, butterflies, included in the graph?
Okay, before we get to why invertebrates are important, I just want to give a quick overview of what they are, that unlike me, you don't just think they're insects, because I used to think that for years. But yeah, invertebrates are basically animals that neither possess nor develop a backbone and actually comprise most of the life on Earth. They're an extremely diverse group of animals, insects, but also including bivalves, squid, earthworms, corals, spiders, sponges. The list is, well, not endless, but pretty close to it. And just to give context of how species rich this group is, South Africa alone has over 55,000 described invertebrate species. And those exclude things that still needs to be discovered and, undescribed species and all that. And many of these 55,000 species do occur in the Western Cape. And then by comparison, if you look at the graph here, the province has only 1,500 vertebrates, which is way less than the inverts. And of these, 126 are terrestrial mammals, and just over 330 are birds. There's also 149 reptile species, 60 amphibians, just over 800 marine fish species, and only 41 freshwater fish species that's been recorded in the province. And then for the purposes of this report, the invertebrates have been limited to the arthropods, and within the arthropod group, only certain subgroups were included, and these were the butterflies, dragonflies, and damselflies. That's the two top bars there in the graph. And the reason for including these groups, it relates to a paucity of knowledge for the other groups, because as I said, they're very diverse, they're very big, there's some undescribed taxonomic diversity. So just in terms of, there's just a lack of knowledge in general in terms of invertebrates, and therefore including them was quite difficult. Butterflies form the bulk of the species on the red data list for insects. They taxonomically well known. They're quite popular because, I mean, they're really pretty species. And all the butterflies were recently assessed as part of the South African Butterfly Conservation Assessment Project. And similarly, all South African dragon and damselflies have been assessed in terms of their conservation status. And just to get back on why invertebrates are important, yeah, I think invertebrates are inextricably linked to human life. We just think the role that invertebrates play in terms of pollinating important food crops. I mean, without pollinators, I mean, where would our food come from? If you think of things like mites and earthworms and springtails, I mean, they're critical for soil biodiversity and soil nutrient cycling. And on the perhaps less positive side for people, many invertebrates are vectors for diseases. I think malaria is probably the first one we'll think of. It's also agriculturally important diseases such as African horse sickness. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that invertebrates are pretty much part of our lives, and a very important part of that.
Thank you, Martine. For the groups shown on the graph, it looks as though the most in danger or the most threatened are the fish, freshwater and marine. Why is this so?
Well, in the national recent national biodiversity assessment, the freshwater fish have emerged as the most threatened vertebrate group in the country, and this is especially true for the freshwater fish of the Western Cape. And what makes the fish in this province so unique is that they most of them are endemic, which means they only occur in this province. Some of them are very highly range restricted, which means that despite being endemic in a small province or in a small part of the country, they're endemic within even smaller parts of that distribution range. I mean, some species are endemic down to river system level, some are even more endemic down to catchment level. And over and above that, there's a lot of genetic research that's been conducted by the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity. And what their work is showing is that there's a lot of unique lineages within known species. So, so what basically happens is we think we've got this relatively widespread species, but if you look at it genetically, it's actually subpopulations that are genetically quite distinct, and many of these warrant description, or in future will be described as new species. And the primary threats to these taxa are the loss of habitat. I don't think day zero is that far into the past that we've forgotten about it. So loss of habitat as a result, very often of water over abstraction and just general very stiff competition for water use between the environment and agriculture and domestic use and industrial use. And then also alien invasive fish is, well, globally it's a big threat, and nowhere more so than in the Western Cape. And if you just look at the map here, I think you'll have to look hard to find the little green bits, but those are the catchments where there's no alien invasive species present. Everything else, the red, the brown, the purple, the yellow, it shows the catchment where there's at least one invasive species present and established. And these species affect indigenous species mainly through predation, but also through competition. And then if we look at marine fish, despite being very different in terms of like levels of endemism and distribution ranges, you know, they are almost as threatened as their freshwater counterparts. But here the threats are quite different. The threats relate mainly to unsustainable and illegal harvesting. And then coupled with this is also the anthropogenic impacts on estuarine systems. Many young fish use estuaries as breeding and nursery areas, and many estuaries have decreased ecological functioning. And this is a result of pollution, decreased freshwater inflow. So you can already here see the sort of the link between why the freshwater fish are in trouble and why the marine fish are in trouble. That's that whole like freshwater influx going into the estuaries. Yeah, and also there's artificial mouth manipulation, which will affect the estuary's ecological functioning. But all is not lost in terms of the marine fish. There's marine protected areas that have been declared. And here on the map, you'll see Gokama MPA, designated to protect habitat for threatened angling and commercial fish species, such as the Halyoen and the red Roman. So the MPA functions to mitigate the fishing pressure as well as protecting habitat. Yeah, so it is looking up a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martine. I see we have a question from Liz Spark asking to what extent does CapeNature partner with sandparks and also with the city? I have the Black River and tributaries in mind.
Yeah, I don't think, I think the level of partnership with those organizations at this stage, it's rather taxon specific in terms of sort of mammal and game research. We are very strongly partnering with sandparks. On the fish side, we've initiated collaboration. Myself and John Host, one of my fellow panelists, will be working with sandparks in the Southern Cape. Well, if it wasn't for COVID, our surveys would have been done jointly than sandparks. City of Cape Town we also collaborate with, but I definitely think there's always room for more collaboration, and especially in terms of the genetic research and the new lineages I was referring to earlier on in terms of the freshwater fish. The Cape Galaxias, it's a little widespread, currently one widespread species throughout the province. It's going to be split into 13 or 14 unique species. It's still on research that's well, it's almost ready for publication. And then I think we'll pretty much be putting a what's it for glass, a magnifying glass over the city of Cape Town and all those small rivers, because it is very possible that there's unique galaxid lineages that are highly threatened in those rivers, which will definitely benefit from improved collaboration with City of Cape Town.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on to a question for Jean Hoos. Thank you very much, Martine. That was very
Thank you.
Good evening, Jean.
Good evening, Carol.
Can you tell us why ecological flow and the ecological reserve is important to freshwater systems?
I'll start off, I think, with the ecological flow, which basically supports the ecological function, pattern, and biodiversity, meaning the animals and plants that are dependent on these river systems, actually wetlands and the groundwater systems as well, as they are considered to be one of the water users according to the water affairs policies, and a certain percentage of flow is required to be allocated to these environments as a water user. Which then refers to the ecological reserve. The importance of flow requirements particularly came to the fore during the recent drought and also continued drought in some parts of the province. With regards to water supply for human needs, it relates to the required quantity, quality, and distribution of flow patterns, basically from the source areas down to the river mouth or the estuaries, as Martine talked about a little bit earlier. For the preservation of life in these catchments, which includes the fauna and the flora that are dependent on these ecosystems. I'll go now to the ecological reserve, which basically refers to the flow that is required to maintain this ecological function on which we and the fauna and flora depend. Major threats to this would be major land use impacts, often anthropogenically directed. And then also, while allowing for us to use it sustainably without impacting on both the long-term sustainability of the freshwater and any other associated terrestrial ecosystems, which shows then a clear link to the ecosystem services that are provided by our groundwater, river and wetland ecosystems.
Thank you very much. Has the wetland threat statuses changed between the previous assessment and the current one?
Yes, it has, unfortunately, especially in our lowland areas. It's basically very clear in the two graphs presented on the slide. Due to various land use impacts and other impacts associated with population growth, for example. According to the most recent national assessment for biodiversity, wetlands and estuaries are considered to be the most threatened ecosystems in South Africa. And this is very likely or very surely the case in the Western Cape province as well. The reason why wetlands are so threatened is because they vary according to various variables, including the region they are based in, the topography of the area, the hydrogeomorphic zone, meaning also linking it to topography, the underlying geology, the water source, as well as the wetland plant communities, amongst a variation of other things. And this makes them even more vulnerable to impact and degradation. Especially when you think in terms of something like endemicity, which was also mentioned by Martin earlier, of species. One could probably, and very broadly, apply this concept of endemicity to wetland ecosystem types in relation to the levels found in at least some special vegetation types of the Cape floristic region.
Thanks, Jean. What are strategic water source areas and why are they important?
Strategic water source areas are important mountain catchments, and this also includes the lower lying areas that have been identified as important for the provision of both surface and groundwater for the different types of water users, which includes the environment. But more specifically, these areas are defined as catchments that firstly supply a large volume of surface water in relation to the size of the area that catches the water, or it has a high level of groundwater recharge, or it can be a combination of surface water and groundwater yields. These areas could be either national priorities or provincial priorities, and their importance has once again also been highlighted during the recent and continued drought in some parts. Just as also something that's been mentioned on the slide is CapeNature protected areas houses parts of 5 of the South Africa's 22 strategic water source areas in our mountain catchments. And these catchments not only provide sustained high yields of good quality water for human needs within them, but also for the needs of the biodiversity components that are dependent on freshwater ecosystems. In other words, they provide the ecological flow required to sustain life and meet the ecological reserves that have been set and still needs to be set for rivers, wetlands, and groundwater systems in the Western Cape province.
Thank you very much, John. I don't see any additional questions. Oh, wait, there is a question. Question from Leslie Scott. Or maybe it's a comment. She says, thank you for the well-presented report. Can you advise how CapeNature's management of wetlands has changed, or if it has changed after the drought?
I think that the main way it's changed is I think there's a lot more focus on freshwater ecosystems, including wetlands, in recent years in CapeNature. And we have certainly worked in the monitoring of these systems, especially since the threats posed by groundwater abstraction and linked to the aquifer-dependent ecosystems or the groundwater-dependent ecosystems into our protected area management plans that have undergone redevelopment in the past few years. Yeah, I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Jean. Thank you, Leslie, for the question. I'm going to move on to the next question, which I'm going to pose to Chanel. Thank you, Jean. We'll catch up with you later. Chanel, can you tell us about all the protected areas in the Western Cape, whether they are managed by CapeNature?
Sure, thank you, Coral. So to answer your question, no. Different protected areas have different management authorities, and that's decided by the MEC or the National Minister. So in the Western Cape specifically, CapeNature manages provincial nature reserves and some marine protected areas, but there are also other protected areas managed by other bodies. So for example, SANParks manages national parks, for example, the Table Mountain National Park. Municipalities manage local authority nature reserves like Tygerberg Nature Reserve, and private landowners also manage their own private or contract nature reserves. There's also other kinds of protected areas like special nature reserves and mountain catchment areas and protected environments. And these are all detailed in our Protected Areas Act, which is the piece of legislation that governs all of our protected areas. We also have conservation areas, and these are a little bit different from protected areas because they're not legally designated under the Act, but they are still vitally important to conservation.
Thank you. Chanel, how does protected area expansion work?
Okay, so South Africa has a national protected area expansion strategy, and each of the 9 provinces draw up a provincial version that aligns with this national version. So CapeNature revises its provincial strategy every 5 years. In fact, we've just completed our current plan. So the strategy's objectives are to protect critically endangered ecosystems and key species, to protect underprotected and strategic landscapes, and to protect our coastal, marine, estuarine, and freshwater ecosystems that we just spoke about. So we take those objectives and spatially represent them in a priority map, and this helps us conserve the most important areas first. The map also details the urgency, the lead, and the mechanism that's proposed so that we can add these areas to our conservation estate. We also have 4 main mechanisms for protected area expansion, which I'll run through quickly. The first is stewardship, which is our primary mechanism for the last 15 years, and where we depend quite strongly on partnerships in the landscape. Secondly, we focus on regularization of existing protected areas. And this is mostly to make sure that protected areas that were proclaimed many years ago, sometimes under older legislation, are still meaningfully contributing to conservation. The third method is through the transfer of state land to a conservation body. For example, we have exit forestry land from national government that's in the process of being transferred to provincial government so it can be managed by CapeNature. And then finally, the fourth way, in very rare cases, our partners can purchase or donate land for CapeNature to manage.
Thank you, Chanel. How does the stewardship program work, and how do landowners benefit from it?
Okay, so CapeNature chairs the Western Cape Stewardship Review Committee. So when a site is proposed for stewardship, the committee gets together and assesses which stewardship option is best suited to the site based on its biodiversity value. So each stewardship option matches the level of support that we offer to the landowner with the level of commitment that we receive from the landowner. So, for example, if we compare a contract nature reserve with a biodiversity agreement, a contract nature reserve is protected by the Protected Areas Act for a minimum of 30 years, but often into perpetuity. And this is the highest level of protection that we can offer. CapeNature offers substantial assistance with habitat management on these sites, like clearing aliens, and in turn, the landowners have to keep the site in as natural a condition as possible, with only a very light impact or perhaps a few ecotourism cabins and a hiking trail. In contrast, a biodiversity agreement is protected by contract law and not by the Protected Areas Act, and that's for a minimum of 10 years. So CapeNature is less involved in these sites, but we still assist the landowner plan for specific interventions like alien clearing. And in turn, the landowner has a bit more flexibility in the land use. They're still allowed to continue with lower impact activities like farming, as long as it's in a way that still allows natural processes to continue. In terms of the benefits, CapeNature has seen many landowners benefit from the stewardship program, and some of these benefits include better management of natural resources, improving our water quality and water quantity in our catchments, and reducing soil erosion and flooding. Also, when landowners get involved in conservation, they have access to support and advice from CapeNature staff, and their income base can be diversified through ecotourism and other conservation-related opportunities.
Thank you very much, Chanel. I don't see any questions posed to you. Wait, there is an anonymous attendee. It says, does this mean that CapeNature can support farmers in offering agritourism?
Yes, that can be an option for us. So the idea is that we get in touch with landowners who are interested in the stewardship program, and we start to negotiate what is the best option for the landowner. We always bear in mind that the rights to the property are always vested with the landowner themselves, and it's all voluntary arrangements that are made, and all the agreements are voluntary. So it really depends on a one-on-one conversation that you can have with CapeNature. And if you're interested, we can put you in touch with the stewardship person that's responsible for your area.
Thank you very much, Chanel, and thank you to the anonymous attendee. I'm going to move on to a question for Philippa. Thank you very much, Chanel. We'll catch up with you in a bit. So Philippa, can you maybe share with us what are the main threats to our biodiversity and healthy ecosystems?
Sure. Hi there, Coral. Just checking you can see me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Yes, sadly, there are a number of threats to biodiversity. Habitat loss is probably one of the main threats, not only here in the Western Cape, but around the world. Then, of course, climate change, very topical, and a major threat as well. Fire, particularly, as you mentioned earlier, too frequent fires. Invasive alien species, as Martine mentioned earlier. Then over-abstraction of freshwater, pollution, biodiversity crime, such as illegal harvesting and illegal trade, are also threats to our biodiversity.
So thank you. What does CapeNature do to address threats to our biodiversity and ecosystems?
So CapeNature has a landscape approach to conservation, and that includes a range of on-the-ground actions and plans. It's important to remember that CapeNature works across the whole province, not just on CapeNature nature reserves, but off-reserve as well. So we work across the entire province. In the context of land use planning and addressing habitat loss, CapeNature is the commenting authority on biodiversity for the Western Cape. Practically, this means that we review individual development applications, planning applications, municipal STFs, as well as provide comment on provincial and national environmental laws and guidelines, both new and amendments to existing ones. The objective of our comments is to ensure the best possible biodiversity outcomes, and also to ensure that there's no weakening of existing environmentally related legislation. The Western Cape Biodiversity Spatial Plan, or BSP, is the main conservation tool that is used to inform decision-making in land use. It's a spatial informant or map that identifies priority areas for the protection of biodiversity and ecological infrastructure. It shows us where our most important biodiversity areas are. Critical biodiversity areas are also just called CBAs, the acronym, and ecological support areas, ESAs. So it shows us where those are within the landscape. And those are obviously the most important areas to try and look after. I mentioned ecological infrastructure earlier. Protecting our ecological infrastructure is also really a priority. Ecological infrastructure refers to naturally functioning ecosystems that deliver valuable services to people, such as fresh water, climate regulation, soil formation, disaster risk reduction. Examples of ecological infrastructure include healthy mountain catchments, rivers, wetlands, groundwater recharge areas, coastal dunes, and nodes and corridors of natural habitat. I've spoken a fair bit about the BSP. There are other management tools and informants. Some of these are, as Chanel already mentioned, the Western Cape Protected Area Expansion Strategy, the Western Cape State of Biodiversity Report, Protected Area Management Plans, or PAMPs for short, Biodiversity Management Plans for Species, various nature conservation policies. There are many different nature conservation policies. And then, of course, the Provincial Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, or PBSAP, which is a joint initiative with us and the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning. That's the Provincial Western Cape Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning. So yeah, that's that.
Thanks, Philip. Globally, there's an increased awareness about the threats of climate change. What is CapeNature doing to address the threats of climate change?
Yes, there certainly is really increased global awareness about climate change. I think climate change is one of those examples of something that's really become, as a concept, really become mainstreamed. And CapeNature is doing has a range of different responses to the threat of climate change. I mentioned the Biodiversity Spatial Plan earlier. This identifies climate change adaptation corridors. And protecting these, focusing on protecting these climate change adaptation corridors enables safeguarding of habitat and allowing space for species to move in response to a changing environment. Climate change corridors also allow for functional habitat connectivity. And there are many climate change corridors that have been identified and form part of the Biodiversity Spatial Plan. Good progress is being made in terms of safeguarding these, which is really good news. For example, between 2017 and 2020, the percentage area of climate change corridors within protected areas in the Western Cape increased from 2.5% to 10.6%, which is a really, remarkable increase. There are also a number of mitigation measures that on our CapeNature reserves, particularly in relation to our tourist accommodation. Typically, these are low carbon footprint eco-developments, which include, for example, passive heating and cooling so that you use less electricity, use of solar power, and a number of water-saving measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that there is a comment and a question from Leslie Richardson in relation to whether there is budget to educate and enthuse owners and inhabitants of these areas to conserve our natural resources, and noting that extension services have diminished a lot over the past. I don't know whether Chanel would want to try and attempt to answer that question.
Sure, I can give it a go. Just give me a second. There we go. Yes, so we are aware that our protected areas are definitely affected by what goes on around the protected area. We actually do take this into account when we do our protected area management planning, which happens per complex. And we call this the zone of influence. So it's looking at what are the competing land uses and the opportunities for better land use around our protected area complexes. And we try and focus our efforts on these specific landowners so we can make sure that the impacts of the protected area on the neighboring land is positive and vice versa. So we don't have a specific budget allocated for it, as you asked specifically, but we do take it into account when we do our reserve management.
Thank you, Chanel, and thank you, Leslie, for the question. I note that there's a question from Gerardo Pretorius, who is asking whether the Western Cape biodiversity areas are available to the public as KMZ files for Google Earth for prospective projects. So either Philippa or Chanel can respond to him in terms of the availability, probably Chanel, availability of data layers and information.
Hi there. Yes, we actually do have a lot of our biodiversity data available online through our website at CapeNature's website, as well as through our partner on Cape Farm Mappers. So we can post the links to your answer as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I note that there's a question on the status of the crocodiles in the Breda River. I unfortunately don't have an updated status report with me, but we will provide you with an answer via email. I'm going to move on to our next panelist, Dr. Andrew Turner, and ask him what is the difference between alien species and invasive alien species.
Hi, everyone. Hi there, Coral. Alien species are basically species that do not naturally occur in an area. So it very much depends on what area you're talking about. It's not just species from overseas. So to take a more locally focused example, a species that naturally occurs in Limpopo can be an alien species in the Western Cape province. But not all species are invasive. Many alien species are benign or even quite beneficial. You think of wheat or maize, for example. So to be an invasive alien species, you have to do some harm. You must have some kind of negative effect, like using up too much water or outcompeting indigenous species, or negatively affecting agricultural production, as many of the weedy species do. Or at the worst end of the spectrum, and is particularly the case, as Martine mentioned earlier, with the invasive alien fish, they can eat up our indigenous fish. And a problem that is very close to home that has already come up in the chat is the effect that invasive alien species, particularly woody trees, can have on the intensity, severity of fires. So it can end up making the fires far worse. And this doesn't matter whether these species come in accidentally or intentionally. But the big problem is that once they're here, they can be very difficult to control, and in many cases quite expensive to control. And if you don't control them, that might also lead to very large economic losses.
Thanks, Andrew. What is CapeNature doing about these invasive alien species?
So the first thing is to think of is where these alien species are. And unfortunately, most of the province is affected. And in fact, even in our protected areas, at least one invasive alien species is recorded in all of our areas. So we need to map them, and then we need to prioritize them. And you can do this in two ways. You can look at the species and evaluate how much impact they have. So tackle the worst ones first. And you can also look at the areas that they are affecting. So if you concentrate on areas where important ecosystem services are being delivered, and I'm thinking of things here like water delivery, you can prioritize those areas for work first up. We need really functional collaborative partnerships to get this work done. This also came up in the chat as to how difficult this is to do and how much funding it takes. But we're piloting a very promising collaborative effort called the Greater Cape Town Water Fund, in which governments, NGOs, and the private sector all come together to plan and actually carry out invasive species control work to achieve better ecosystem functioning and better water security. And then with our research partners, we're also looking at new methods of controlling invasive alien species, trying to improve our efficiency and our effectiveness. And it's very clear from looking at the way aliens have changed over time that speed is really key. In invasive alien species in this province move really fast, and we need to be able to move at the same pace, in fact, at a faster pace, to get on top of them.
Thank you very much, Andrew. What can the public do? What can anybody do about invasive alien species? What advice do you have?
So I guess the starting point is to know what invasive alien species are, be able to identify them, at least, to be able to say, okay, this is an Australian wattle or a European pine. You don't have to get it much better than that in many cases, but to be able to distinguish invasive aliens from indigenous species is a good starting point. And then I would urge people not to buy or plant invasive alien plants. Once you know that, you can easily avoid that. And it's not just the plants, you've got to think about the animals too. So especially do not release invasive alien animals into the wild. There are various things that you can do as well to help get rid of aliens that have already established. So you can join local hack groups. It's a very rewarding thing to do. And control any invasive alien species that are under your control in your garden, on your farm, etc. But the short of it is that we all need to tackle this problem together, because invasive alien species are everywhere and they spread frighteningly fast.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm not noting any specific questions. Let me just see. There's a question from Jean-Pierre Murray Klein. And he says, thank you for the webinar. 2 quick questions. Does anyone on your panel know if there are any technological projects taking place in the Cape that are negatively affecting biodiversity? And secondly, are there any new innovative and prevalent technologies being used in the Cape to support biodiversity? And maybe, Andrew, you can respond to that. It does follow on, I think, from some of the work that you've been involved in.
Okay, so I'm not quite sure what Jean-Pierre is referring to about technological projects, but to tackle the second part of the question, there are constantly improving technologies, particularly in terms of remote sensing. That's getting better, it's getting faster, and we can use remote sensing to see what's going on without having to drive around all over the countryside. We can use images derived from satellites and images derived recently from drone footage to see what's going on and monitor these changes over time. And that offers great opportunities for automating these processes so you don't involve people doing really difficult on-screen work that is very hard to get done in time. As I said earlier, these invasive alien species move fast. So wherever we can use technology to improve our response rate, that would really help.
Thank you, Andrew. I see there's a question from Ernst Bart, who wants to know whether we will be able to win the battle against the aliens.
This depends very much on how much we want to win the battle. If we really put in the collective effort that's required, I think, yes, it can be done. But it requires a concerted and constant effort. You can't do it in a stop-start fashion. Once you get going, you've got to be committed and push it through to the end.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on with our next panelist. Thank you very much, Andrew, for all those insights. I'm going to ask Lucille Ross, our compliance specialist, to explain to us what is biodiversity crime and how much of an issue it is in the Western Cape.
Sure, Carol. Good evening, everybody. Biodiversity crime is basically any illegal activity that targets fauna and flora that originates from nature. It can range from hunting and the poaching of wild animals to picking and trafficking of indigenous flora. And this is actually a very serious issue in the Western Cape, and it presents a significant challenge to conservation and enforcement agencies. Because the Western Cape has very unique biodiversity, we host most of the Cape Floristic Kingdom, and because of the high levels of endemic species, the Western Cape is a very attractive target for illegal traffickers that come from around the world to target our reptiles, our flora, and other taxa that are only found here in the Western Cape.
Thank you very much for that answer and for those insights. So typically, what do poachers take from the province?
Well, basically, it depends on what is in demand around the world in the international markets. During the period under review, a number of high-profile cases involving foreign collectors were investigated in the Western Cape. And I'm going to mention two of these cases that are prime examples of the type of individuals involved in illegal activities and the species that are targeted by such collectors. In a case registered in Liveris involving the illegal capture of armadillo-girdled lizards, one of the accused had been prosecuted and imprisoned in both in Indonesia and in Australia for reptile trafficking. In fact, he traveled to South Africa and within weeks of being deported from Australia. In another case in Ashton involving the trafficking of 2018 succulent plants, one of the accused was wanted on a United States federal warrant of arrest, and cooperation between South Africa and the US authorities facilitated his extradition to face charges related to the illegal trafficking of succulent plants in California. So these two cases illustrate the nature of the threat posed by illegal trafficking. And also subsequent to the period under review, there has been a marked increase in the number of incidents involving the trafficking of succulent plants.
Thank you very much, Lucille. What step do we take against these traffickers? And I think if you can add on to that, what can anyone do towards combating biodiversity crime?
Okay, so they are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Accused are often sentenced to direct imprisonment without the option of a fine. Foreign nationals are also deported and declared persona non grata, which prevents them from returning to the country after deportation. And to everyone that is listening now, and our communities, we need to educate them about the trade in fauna and flora, and also to keep their eyes open for any activity that looks odd and to report that to CapeNature or to the police where appropriate.
Thank you very, very much, Lucille, for those insights. I think I see a comment from Gavin Monefeld, and he is asking, with an ever-decreasing budget, how does CapeNature plan to continue doing its sterling conservation work? Thank you very much, Gavin, for that comment. I think we will persevere and we will pursue partnerships to continue to do our work. I think Andrew is busy typing a lengthier response to that. And if there aren't any other questions, I'm not seeing any, or comments right now. I think we've come very close to the end of our program this evening. So I would like to thank the panel members, if they can all switch on their cameras, and so that everybody can see them, and then there's an opportunity for anybody who wants to direct a last question as we come to the end of our program. Before we close off with the program, I would like to do the wheel spin and say that we have done a lucky draw on a computer. It randomly selected Etienne Slobbert as the winner of the wild card. So congratulations to Etienne Slobbert. You will be contacted via email in terms of how to access your wild card so that you can go and visit all of our nature reserves. And okay, I see there's another comment here from Kuba Whiskey. Sorry, I cannot pronounce that. We've trialed aerial spray applications of herbicides to black wattle and stinkbean. We have had relative success with this method. Andrew would like to answer this question, so you can go ahead. Comment from Ernst Bart. Well done, CapeNature. Thank you, Ernst. And Kuba is asking whether we have a strategy to make reserves more accessible to youth for hiking. Cederberg wilderness area has become very expensive for multi-day hikes. Kuba, I'm going to not respond to your question right now, but I will refer it to the relevant section within CapeNature to provide you with a response. Thank you very, very much. We're almost on time to close off and say goodbye. So thank you very much to all of our participants and all my panelists. You've been awesome in assisting us. And for all the participants, please do make sure to download a copy of our State of Conservation report. And if you have any additional questions, please post them to learning@capenature.co.za and have a look at our website, www.capenature.co.za. Thank you very, very much.